Day 3. Elias has a headache that won't quit, snaps at a coworker over something genuinely trivial, and spends an embarrassing amount of mental energy thinking about a candy bar he saw in a vending machine 4 hours ago. He cut out added sugar exactly 72 hours ago. Nothing else changed. Same sleep, same job, same stress level. Just no sugar. Here's the question worth sitting with for a second. If sugar isn't a drug, and it isn't, not in the pharmacological sense, why does quitting it feel a lot like withdrawal? The honest answer isn't mystical, and it isn't hype. It's two well-understood biological systems doing exactly what they're built to do, reacting to a genuinely large change in their normal operating conditions. You don't need a sugar is basically heroin framework to explain what Elias is feeling on day 3. You need blood sugar regulation and dopamine signaling, two systems that are real, well-studied, and sufficient on their own to explain this entire 14-day timeline. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what's happening in the body across all 14 days. Not a hype-based transformation story, an actual mechanism-by-mechanism breakdown. And you'll understand exactly why day 3, not day 1, tends to be the hardest day for almost everyone. Let's start with the concept underneath this. Added sugar, consumed regularly, creates two predictable patterns: repeated sharp spikes and drops in blood glucose, and repeated activation of the brain's dopamine reward pathway. Neither of these is inherently sinister. They're just what happens when a fast-absorbing carbohydrate source shows up frequently and predictably. The body adapts to whatever pattern it experiences repeatedly. Remove that pattern suddenly, and the systems that adapted to it need time to recalibrate. That recalibration period is what produces every symptom in this video. Not sugar leaving your system, which happens within hours, but your regulatory systems adjusting to its absence, which takes considerably longer. So here are the 4 phases mapped across the 14 days. Notice that every single symptom has a specific, explainable mechanism behind it. Nothing mystical, nothing requiring sugar is toxic language to make sense. Phase 1, days 1 through 3. Blood sugar volatility. When sugar intake drops suddenly, the body's glucose regulation system, accustomed to frequent large inputs, temporarily overcorrects. Insulin release patterns that were calibrated to expect regular spikes now occasionally produce mild dips even without a new sugar hit, because the system hasn't yet recalibrated to the new baseline. This is the actual mechanism behind the headaches, the irritability, and the difficulty concentrating that shows up around day 2 or 3. It's not sugar leaving the body that happens in hours. It's the glucose-insulin feedback loop adjusting its own sensitivity to a new, lower variability input pattern, and that adjustment period is measured in days, not hours. Phase 2, days 4 through 7, the dopamine reset. This is the phase almost nobody explains correctly, and it's the one most responsible for cravings that feel disproportionate to missing dessert. Repeated sugar consumption reliably activates dopamine release in the brain's reward circuitry. Not uniquely, other pleasurable activities do this too, but reliably and frequently, in a way that trains the reward system to expect that specific trigger. When the trigger stops, the reward system doesn't malfunction. It does exactly what a well-calibrated prediction system should do. It registers the absence of an expected reward, which produces a craving signal. This isn't a moral failing or weak willpower. It's a prediction system correctly noticing that something it learned to expect isn't showing up, and that noticing itself has a felt, sometimes uncomfortable quality. By around day 5 or 6, most people report the craving intensity beginning to decline. Not because willpower improved, but because the prediction system is updating its expectations based on the new, consistent pattern of absence. Phase 3, days 8 through 10, the insulin sensitivity shift. This phase is quieter and less dramatic than the first 2, which is exactly why it matters. It's the mechanism actually doing the useful long-term work, even though it doesn't produce a strong felt symptom the way phases 1 and 2 do. With less frequent large glucose spikes to respond to, cells throughout the body, particularly muscle and liver tissue, gradually become more responsive to a given amount of insulin. This is a genuinely significant physiological shift, and it's the mechanism most directly responsible for the more stable energy levels people report starting around the 2nd week. It doesn't feel dramatic while it's happening, which is precisely why most sugar detox content skips right past it in favor of describing more attention-grabbing early symptoms. Phase 4, days 11 through 14. Energy stabilization. By this point, the sharp swings from phase 1 and the craving intensity from phase 2 have both substantially settled, and the improved insulin responsiveness from phase 3 starts to show up as something people can actually feel. Steadier energy across the day, without the early afternoon crash that a high-frequency sugar pattern reliably produces. This isn't more energy in some vague, hyped sense. It's specifically fewer sharp peaks and valleys, which most people experience as feeling more even and predictable rather than dramatically more energized. Let's walk through Elias's actual 14 days with this mechanism in view. Days 1 and 2. Mild, manageable adjustment, barely noticeable. Day 3. The headache and irritability from blood sugar volatility peak, his hardest day, and predictably so, since this is exactly when the glucose-insulin recalibration is most active. Days 4 through 6. The vending machine cravings intensify before they improve, right on schedule for the dopamine reset phase. Worth noting explicitly, because a lot of people quit exactly here, assuming worsening cravings mean the approach isn't working, when it's actually the expected shape of this specific mechanism. Day 7. Cravings noticeably softer. Days 8 through 10. Nothing dramatic happens, which is itself the insulin sensitivity phase doing its quiet work. Days 11 through 14. Elias notices he's no longer hunting for something at 3 in the afternoon. Not because he's developed superhuman discipline, but because the sharp glucose swing that used to trigger that specific craving simply isn't happening anymore. None of what Elias experienced was a sign of weakness, and none of it required unusual willpower to move through. It required understanding that the discomfort had a specific, temporary, mechanism-based explanation, rather than treating it as evidence that something was going wrong. So what actually helps during these 14 days, mechanism by mechanism, rather than through sheer willpower? During phase 1, pair any remaining carbohydrate intake with protein and fiber. This isn't a trick. It directly slows glucose absorption, reducing the sharp spikes and dips the recalibrating insulin system is still oversensitive to, which measurably softens the headache and irritability symptoms specific to this phase. During phase 2, expect the craving intensity to rise before it falls, and don't treat that rise as a sign of failure. Understanding that cravings peaking around day 5 is the expected shape of dopamine pathway recalibration, not a signal that the approach isn't working, is often the single biggest factor in whether someone continues past this phase or not. During phase 1 and 2 both, protect sleep specifically. Sleep deprivation independently worsens both glucose regulation and next-day craving intensity, which means poor sleep during the hardest days doesn't just add a separate problem, it actively intensifies the two mechanisms already doing the most work during this window. During phase 3, when nothing dramatic seems to be happening, that's expected. This is intentionally the quiet phase. The insulin sensitivity shift is happening whether or not it produces a strongly felt symptom, and expecting a dramatic feeling here, then feeling discouraged by its absence, is a common and avoidable reason people abandon the process right before phase 4's more noticeable payoff. During phase 4, pay attention to the specific shape of the change, not more energy in a vague sense, but fewer sharp peaks and valleys across the day. Noticing this specific, mechanism-consistent pattern is a more reliable confirmation that something real changed than any subjective, feeling better impression alone. Elias's 14 days weren't a willpower story, even though it can look that way from the outside. Two specific, well-understood biological systems needed time to recalibrate to a new, lower variability pattern, and every symptom he experienced maps directly onto a specific mechanism doing exactly what it evolved to do. This is worth naming directly. The discomfort in the first week wasn't evidence that sugar is uniquely dangerous, and it wasn't evidence of a hidden addiction in the dramatic sense the phrase usually implies. It was two ordinary regulatory systems, glucose control and reward prediction, adjusting to a real, meaningful change in their input pattern on a timeline that's actually well documented and fairly predictable once you know what to look for. The good news is that once you know the shape of these 4 phases, the hardest days stop feeling like mysterious suffering and start feeling like exactly what they are: a specific, temporary, explainable process with a known and fairly short timeline. You don't need to frame this as fighting an addiction to get through it. You need to understand that day 3 is supposed to be hard, that day 5's cravings are supposed to rise before they fall, and that the real payoff, the quiet, steady energy of phase 4, was never going to announce itself loudly. It was always going to show up exactly the way steady, well-regulated systems tend to, quietly, and mostly by the absence of the problem you'd gotten used to having. A note before we close. This video describes general physiological patterns and is for educational purposes only, not medical advice. If you have diabetes, are on blood sugar-related medication, or have any condition affected by dietary changes, talk to a healthcare provider before making significant changes to your sugar intake.